All right, hey, well, I did get cut off at the end of that last video, but that was actually a pretty good place to end. That was right where I was trying to wrap it up anyway. So um, here we are. What you might remember from the last video is that we just learned that markets are efficient, meaning that they maximize the net benefit to society. But here's the catch. That's only true under certain circumstances. And this is really important to understand. I think this really helps you understand politics because Republicans usually argue markets are good, we need to keep the government out of them. Well, that's true under certain circumstances. Democrats often argue markets need to be regulated, we need the government to regulate them and have an active role. That's true under certain circumstances. So understanding this part of this chapter, I think, is really crucial. So here's the deal. Markets are efficient if there's lots of competition, meaning there are many buyers, many sellers. Nobody's big enough and powerful enough to affect the market prices or change the market in any way. You don't have monopolies and things like that. Number two, you need good information for everyone. Buyers and sellers both need to really understand each other, understands the products that they're looking at and things like that. And third, property rights have to be clearly defined, and well enforced. If all these things are true, markets work really well. But there's a thing called market failure. Market failure means that markets aren't allocating resources efficiently or they're not maximizing the net benefit to society. When that happens, it's because one of these three assumptions is not met. So we're going to talk about market failure a bit in this video. There are 5 types of market failure. Your book only lists 4. I added number 5 down there, but here they are. Non-competitive markets, public goods, external costs and benefits, common property resources, and imperfect information. And each of these is tied to one of the assumptions that we just talked about. So number 1, non-competitive markets violates that assumption of competitive markets, obviously. That was pretty obvious. 2, 3, and 4 all are violations of the property rights assumption. We'll talk about those more in a minute, but basically all those are situations where property rights are either unclear or poorly defined or not enforced. And then last, it's pretty obvious that imperfect information violates that assumption of good or perfect information. So I think that's a really important idea to understand, is that markets work well under certain circumstances, but we can clearly identify examples of market failure using these. So we're going to talk about each of these in a little bit more depth. So non-competitive markets basically means that either buyers or sellers have enough power to affect market prices. The most well-known example is monopoly, where you have one big seller who dominates a market. But there's another example called monopsony. That's where instead of the buyer, there's one seller. No, sorry, I said that backwards. Instead of one seller, there's one buyer who dominates the market. Did I say that correctly the first time? Monopoly means there's only one seller of a good. Monopsony means there's only one buyer of a good. That's a little less well known. I'll tell you what, email or text me an example of monopsony if you can think of one, and I'll give you a bonus point. The problem here basically is that if you have something like a monopoly with too much power, they can change the price. They can raise the price if they want to, and that's going to lead to kind of the wrong use of resources. So the solution of that is either some sort of government regulation or something like our antitrust laws to try to put competition back into the market. Number 2, public goods. Public goods are a special class of goods that are defined as follows. It means, first of all, that you cannot exclude the non-payers, meaning once you've provided this good, it's out there, it's freely available, and you can't tell people they can't use it. The second part of it is that the marginal cost of one more user of the good is essentially zero. So some good examples are down there, things like roads, parks, like public parks, or national defense. Those are all things where, once we've provided it, everyone can sort of use it and benefit from it. So from my perspective, why would I pay for it, right? If it's already out there and I can use it for free, I don't want to pay for it. You might think of these, we're all used to thinking of these things as being publicly provided, as in the government provides them. But the point here is there's a reason the government provides them, which is that a free market would never provide these things. You couldn't operate a business creating a city park as we know it. it would have to be a very different thing. You'd have to have gates and entry fees and things like that. But a park, as we know it, just could not work as a business. National defense is kind of the same, right? If you took up money from certain people and defended the whole country, you've defended the whole country. So you're going to have lots of people who are going to say, well, I'm not going to pay. I'm just going to benefit from everybody else paying. So that's the problem with public goods. You're going to get free riders, and a free market is not going to provide these things, at least not enough of them. Therefore, that's why they're often usually provided by the government. Third are external costs and benefits, and I'll talk about these separately. External costs are costs or some sort of harm that's created by one party, but then borne or suffered by another. So classic example is pollution. We got a whole chapter coming up on the economics of pollution, but pollution pretty much always is created by a company or a person, and then it's allowed to be passed off on somebody else. Somebody else kind of suffers the harm for the pollution. Think of the paper mills that we had in Maine for many, many years. They were always located on a river. They would make paper to make a profit. You know, they had to pay the cost of making the paper and hiring the workers and all that. But at the end, they're left over with these nasty chemicals like dioxin, and they would just dump them in the rivers. That would float downstream, make people sick, kill fish. So that was an external cost that was borne by other people, not the paper companies themselves. So the reason this is a problem, the reason it results in market failure is that the companies who are getting the benefit of making the paper underestimate the cost, essentially. They're kind of allowed to pass off part of the cost on somebody else. Therefore, they produce too much of those items and also too much pollution in the process. So there are all kinds of solutions, which we'll get to in Chapter 8, but basically they mostly involve trying to make the polluter pay for the full cost of the product and the pollution that they create. External benefits are kind of the other side of the coin. These are benefits created by one party and then enjoyed by another. So a good example in Bangor, if you're familiar with Bangor, is the waterfront concerts. They bring in all these people, thousands of people come and pay for the concerts. The Sea Dog and the casino and a couple other restaurants happen to be really nearby. Those places all enjoy a big boom in business on concert nights. So the benefits created by the concert business spill over and create benefits to others. Now, you might think this isn't a problem, right? It sounds like a good thing. But the problem with external benefits is if you go back to how markets work and how we maximize net benefit by equating marginal benefits and marginal costs, if we're underestimating the benefits, we're not going to do enough of these activities. So that's the problem. We get inefficient results when the benefits are external because they're sort of underestimated. They're not included in our calculating. Again, we'll talk about this more in Chapter 8, but the solution usually involves either some kind of government subsidy to encourage this activity or some kind of negotiation or something like that. Okay, fourth type of market failure are common property resources. These are resources for which no property rights are really defined. So they're things like oceans, air, rivers, lakes. The problem with those is pretty obvious, I think, that they tend to be overused. You know, if you have something that you can use for free, basically, you're going to use it right down until the benefit is driven almost to zero. So all these things get overutilized. Solutions for these include things like creating property rights or having some kind of government regulation. So I think I'm almost out of time. I'm going to rush through this. Imperfect information, I think, is pretty obvious. If we don't have good information, we don't make good decisions. Example might be high fructose corn syrup. When it first came out, nobody knew how harmful it was, so we were all eating it like crazy. If we had known how bad it was, maybe we wouldn't have eaten as much of it. So the solution to that is just to have some sort of government regulation to ensure good information. So those are your examples of market failure. Time value of money video is part of this chapter, so watch that. You're going to have to do some problems using those kinds of mathematical tools. I think I'm going to make another video helping out with those, so we'll see you next time.